Hello, and welcome to Founding Stories, Oral Histories of Grassroots Atlanta, presented by Art Papers, in partnership with Meredith Cooley, who is here with us. I'm Sarah Higgins. I'm the editor and artistic director of Art Papers. And I'm going to give some introductory comments and then hand it over to our moderator. This discussion is one in a 5-part, 2-day symposium, which takes a decade-by-decade look at some of Atlanta's DIY, artist-run, and grassroots art spaces. The series is focused on beginnings, the events and broader context that led to the creation of these spaces and projects, the opportunities that allowed them to come into being, and the challenges that had to be overcome. Right now, we're joined by the founders, co-founders, and those involved with the genesis of projects that began in the 2010s or 20-teens. Founding Stories is made possible in large part by Emory University's Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library, and is supported by Georgia Humanities in partnership with the Georgia Department of Economic Development through funding from the Georgia General Assembly. There will be time for questions from our audience in the last 30 minutes of the panel. You can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll use that the chat function to provide information and links for the audience. So be sure to keep an eye on that window. There will be information for you, the audience, popping up there. Each panel in this series is moderated by a member of the community who experienced these initiatives firsthand, and in several cases who operated or participated in similar concurrent projects. For this panel, we're pleased to welcome moderator Brandon Sheats. Brandon Sheats is executive director of Murmur, a space for DIY print, art, and music, and digital producer for Atlanta's Office of Cultural Affairs Elevate 2020 program, which just concluded last week. Previously, Brandon was on the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's digital team and served as an advisor to the U.S. Digital Service and as the first in-house digital strategist at the National Black Arts Festival. Welcome, Brandon, and I'll hand things over to you. And as you do introductions, I'm going to show some slides. You're muted also.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to see all of you, to see and get to have this conversation with you all as panelists and for everyone attending. I know it's 11 a.m. on a Saturday, and we're really excited to have you here. Let's go in and let's get our panel introduced for this morning. First up is Willow Goldstein. She is founder of the Bakery Atlanta, a consultant at Cultural Labs, and a board member at iDrum. And Willow is an art administrator and educator with over 10 years of hands-on experience. In Boston, Brooklyn, and Atlanta, she's facilitated programming, created community projects, and coordinated events. Her most recent projects involve the Bakery Atlanta, iDrum Art and Music Gallery, and Atlanta Mutual Aid projects. Next up, we have Elizabeth Jarrett, who's currently creative director for Strange Shapes. She goes by she, her pronouns. She's the co-founder of she was the co-founder and director of Dear Bear Wolf, which is interesting as not a physical space, but as an activator of many spaces in the region. She's currently designer, director, producer, and co-founder of the recently retired Dear Bear Wolf, which produced 5 issues of an arts periodical, dozens of independently produced records and chapbooks, and over 40 events over its 5-year lifespan. She produces and directs the award-winning and immersive theater series Transgression, and works as an experienced designer and creative director for the recently founded Strange Shapes, a studio for imaginative place-based storytelling. Next up, we have Tiffany Latrice. She's an artist and executive director and founder of Tila Studios, an organization that's been in Atlanta from 2016 to the present day. She's currently a visual artist as well, and since 2016, Tila has distributed over $150,000 to artists for residencies, fellowships, and gallery sales. Tiffany Latrice has been featured in the New York Times, Huffington Post, Forbes, and NPR for her work and impact in the art industry and for empowering Black women artists. She's received the 2019 Arts Innovation Luminary Award and C4 Atlanta's 2018 Entrepreneur of the Year Award. Her artwork has been exhibited at the Douglasville Central Cultural Arts Council, Mason Fine Art, Equity Gallery, La Maison d'Art, and the African American Museum in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Next up, we have Pastiche Lumumba. Pastiche is an artist and curator whose multidisciplinary work centers the critical discourse of contemporary culture. In 2013, he co-founded Low Museum of Contemporary Art and Culture with Jordan Stubbs, which we'll get to in a second, here in Atlanta, Georgia, where he served as an executive director. In 2016, he moved to Brooklyn, New York, where he currently works making sculpture and writing internet memes. And last but not least, we have Jordan Stubbs, who's currently operations coordinator at Bonsai Fine Arts, and also a co-founder and the gallery director at the Museum that existed here in the city between 2013 and 2015. Jordan is an artist who holds a BFA in photography from Georgia State University. His work has been shown at Atlanta Contemporary, Camelus, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, and Sway Gallery in Edinburgh, Scotland. All right, everybody. All right, everybody. Since we are talking about founding stories, every organization or space, or in the case of the Bear Wolf publication, starts within certain conditions. Let's not everybody go all at once, but what were the conditions at the time on a local and regional, and I know in a couple of y'all's cases, especially on a national level, that led to you all to really just jump in and get going? And we'll start with whoever wants to pick that up.
I guess I'll start.
Mm-hmm.
We were moving into a different house. It was myself, Jordan, and Theodore McLee. We had just moved out of a subpar house, very subpar house. And, I was finishing school at the time. I was dropping out of Georgia State. And I had just come back from, it was the first year that I went to Art Basel in 2013, and I'd seen all of these things, and I was like, oh my God, this is so nice. There was works that I was seeing that were like technology-based type of works that were about gender and sexuality and all kinds of these things that I wasn't seeing in Atlanta. And then on top of that, there were, as a recent exiter of school, and our contemporaries, Jordan included, people like Wiro, we weren't being shown in the galleries that we were going to. So that was kind of the impetus, is that there was a void for younger artists who are making a little bit more challenging work to be shown around the city.
I'll agree to that. I think it was a case of lacking accessibility and criticality in some spaces. And I think it was as simple as the bones of the Low, the space we rented, just being so primed to become a gallery. I mean, it was a coat of paint that Lumumba put up with some friends. We had tall ceilings and stone floors. And I think that Atlanta was looking for a place like that to exist at the time too.
That's awesome. It seems, I feel like us as creators and innovators always find a void. That is our gift, is finding a void and fixing and finding the solution. I think any great idea or innovation comes when a person experiences great adversity. And for me, that was in 2014 when I left New York City in pursuit of being a full-time artist, even having a pretty extensive background in art. I never did it full-time. So I took a bet on myself and came to Atlanta to do this. And when I was trying to enter into the industry, I experienced a lot of glass ceilings, especially being a Black woman artist here in Atlanta. I thought, hey, I was coming to Chocolate City, but really it's a lot more difficult than what it looked like. And I was knocking down doors and people were saying, hey, no, your work is not strong enough. But I was seeing artists like Shaniqua Gay flourishing, and why weren't the world gravitating towards her work, and why weren't we uplifting her? And I saw Unique Norman working as well, but I was like, what would be so powerful if all these Black women came and collectively worked together in a public space? So Black women taking up public spaces. What would that look like and feel like to transform an industry that often does not recognize us, because Black women artists only make up 4% of art across museums and galleries in the US. So I founded TILA through my own personal journey and adversity of trying to enter into an industry. And I wanted to change that, and I wanted to be the problem that I was trying to solve. And so that's what keeps me motivated, even in the current social, economic, and political climate that we're in now.
That's great. Yeah, I think, Tiffany, what you said about sort of finding that space, right, that kind of where you fit. For us, it was, we started as a publication, and we wanted to kind of create a snapshot of a lot of the creative things that were happening in the city in a form that didn't have any advertisement. So that was a big part of the magazine, was just kind of creating something that, you know, every season somebody could look at and say, oh, this is what was happening in Atlanta during that time in the sort of creative community. We then sort of started to think how we could support artists, independent artists specifically, in other ways. So that then started like to morph into kind of a shop experience where we like offered our platform for artists to sell their goods. And then I was sort of brought on to create a variety show of sorts. I come from the theater world, and I felt that there was like a separation of my friends in the visual art world and the music world and the theater world, but all of these people had something they could really offer each other. So I was really interested in having artists that wouldn't normally work together come together, but also their audiences kind of coming together and experiencing something that they might not see elsewhere by putting these types of performances together that wouldn't normally fit. So yeah, so that was kind of where we started there, and then morphed into a bunch of other platforms. But yeah, it was about sort of connecting people and then bringing people in to experience these independent artists as well.
Okay, so I know there's no audience here, or that I can see, but I'm just really nervous, and I have to say that because it makes me feel better. But so I graduated high school in 2005 in Atlanta, and I left Atlanta in 2006 because I didn't think the city was very, you know, culturally interesting. It didn't have enough to keep me here. I spent 6 years in Boston and 4 years in New York, and then like Tiffany, when I was moving back to Atlanta because of circumstances, because of life in 2016, I was like, oh, I'm going to commit myself to my own artistic practice, and I'm going to learn how to be a full-time artist and figure that out. That didn't work very well. I got a studio at Minimal Gallery and started volunteering at iDrum, and like found my role in arts administration, as I usually do. And but the good thing about 2016 is I was coming back to, you know, all of these spaces we just heard about already existing. I was coming back to kind of an abundance in Atlanta, rather than, you know, there's still a lot of need, and I had just been in Brooklyn, you know, where there's so many spaces. So realizing that there was all these things going on, but they were still pretty underground, you know, I was like, how can I build on what's already here? And so the bakery, being this giant warehouse on 3 acres of space, seemed like a really good place. I come from visual art, so I was like, oh, I'll do a, you know, studio rental to keep the space, you know, meet the operating expenses, and then have some larger formats for people to take ideas that they're playing with in these other spaces and maybe grow them. And that was kind of the idea, and then it shifted, and it morphed for a couple of different reasons. But after the fire on Broad Street, as spaces started to shutter, we just picked up in volume, and it kind of just shifted the trajectory of what the space was.
All right. Wow. Okay. So essentially what I'm seeing here is that there's a really clear sense of there was a major void in my particular space, and you know, you just did it, and you just went out. Everybody just went out and filled it in some kind of way. I want to ask a really quick question, kind of off topic to be on topic. How many of you all are from the city? Ah, okay. Um, and part of the reason I ask that is, one of the common themes, I think, is, to Tiffany, to your point, and to also like Elizabeth, to really everybody's point here, is there's a critical kind of need that needs to be met here. And not necessarily here in Atlanta, but you saw a critical need in whatever your space was. And so my next question for you all is, as you all were starting, did you all have like the ideal audience in mind? Like, was there like, I want these people to come into my space?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, speak on it.
I mean, there's a lot of things that definitely developed over time because our space and like mission started very kind of on the ground and went rolling from there. But there was one thing that even from the beginning, I wanted to, I mean, it's in the name, but I wanted our crowd to be the mixture of this like young DIY crowd and then also have like high museum people come. I wanted us to be a space where you could, have, yeah, I mean, it's really that simple. Just like the young people that I was going to Georgia State with, and then also the people that I would see at high museum parties and openings. And to a certain extent, we got that towards the end. We finally achieved that, and it was I think it's important, and it's a thing that I see in other spaces that like kind of signals that they're at least doing their outreach properly, that they can connect those two crowds, because that was another thing that I see in Atlanta is a lot of like segregation based on a lot of social identities, but definitely one where there's a group of like more established administrators, and not by any like bias or choices of their own, but it's just kind of a little disconnected. And so one of the goals was to definitely connect those two to bridge that gap.
I agree with that as well. I think for us, having a wide range of audiences was really important. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it was really important to remain mobile. And I worked to make sure I was presenting work and performances in different spaces, not in just one sort of area, right? Because I wanted, well, one, accessibility for people to be able to come. But also, yeah, I mean, there's, to Pastiche's point, there's, the sort of DIY crowd and the, the more like high art museum crowd who like go to those types of gallery openings. And I think sort of in the middle, there's this gap. So sort of bridging that and showing that, both forms of performance in my case are valid, right? You have this sort of highbrow and then DIY, but they both are equally important to the community, right? And I think that those audiences have a lot of things to share with each other. So yeah.
Specifically too, sorry, Tiffany.
Oh, go ahead, Jordan.
I'm trying to, mix the crowds, the older people or the people who have these established administrative or curatorial positions in town. They're people who have the more established opportunities to give out to people as well. So if you can create a space that heralds new artists or younger people or fresh ideas, and present it on a really nice polished platter, and show that there's hype around that and a conversation in the community, then I think that is a way of legitimizing those people in the eyes of people who are able to hand out opportunities or shows or things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think like we all cast a really big net when we were first starting out. Mm-hmm. For me, it's like I knew Black women were vast here in Atlanta. So I was just like, let me just try to get as many Black women as possible, right? But Black women aren't monoliths. Black women have so many different variations. So when I casted that wide net in the first year and a half, I realized that we served Black women artists well that had an inherent confidence about their art practice, that had a studio, whether or not it was inside their home, and they weren't just starting out in the art thing for the first time, and they had an opportunity to actually have a professional career. And so it was hard in the first, I think, years of thinking about audience, right? Because audience for us is the women that we serve. And then how do we serve those women to actually get them to the right audience of collectors, right? Of funders, of supporters to actually start elevating their practice. We didn't do that well until we took a really big risk to do our garden fellowship and take Black women to Miami. So we realized that our community, just having a network of Black women, typically between the age of 25 to 35, who were confident, had a passion for art, wanted to pursue a professional career. They just needed a vehicle or dot connector to do that. And so I, knowing my skill set, like, hey, I'm creative, but I'm also really business savvy. I was like, if I had the woman that was ready to take on that challenge, I could grow and scale. And so once we figure out that sweet spot, we were able to increase our economic activity within our community and then figure out our prototype. And it was hard because I love the DIY community. I was like, man, I want to get that hobby artist. I want to get all those people. But in order to make the biggest impact right now as a single woman founder, I had to be very particular about my audience. So in the next iteration of TILA, we're being very intentional about who we serve and why we serve them, and be okay with saying, hey, maybe this is not the right time, but when you're at this point in your career, have 3 to 5 years of experience, let's help you accelerate that, right? Because oftentimes when you're not ready, you end up disappointing someone. And I've done that before. So audience was interesting for me because I just was like, I'm just gonna go for it. Everyone can do it. And it's like, no, it's a game to this in a way.
Well, so you bring up something really interesting, right? Like there's this kind of, and I really want to get kind of Willow's take on this as well, because I think, Willow, you've existed in 2 separate organizations that are, you know, both artists run, but there's this kind of break that happens between the point where you start going in and starting something, and then you realize, oh, I'm starting something. And people are watching now, and that audience wants to, and like there's an audience of whatever kind we find. So like what happens in that space? Like, you know, you go in with one goal, right? And that's whatever it is to all of you. But where kind of what's that point where you went from what you walked in and envisioned and like reality just kind of hit?
For me, that happened all pretty quickly. You know, when I was starting, I was like, I wonder if there's enough, you know, because it's kind of a saturated, luckily a saturated scene, you know, outside of EAV, outside of the Goat Farm, outside of Broad Street, outside of, you know, just other spaces that are existing. Is there going to be enough people to come to this new space, to keep it, to activate it and to attend it? And very quickly, I mean, circumstances outside of my control changed this, but you know, I went from hoping that people would come and then hoping it'd be really, you know, multi-generational, so that there's a lot of shared wisdom, and people that I grew up with in Atlanta would come and new people would come and it would expand. And then kind of super quickly, because of it being, there wasn't temperature control, because it was, a little dirty, it became clear that it was younger kids that were going to be more interested in this space. And the volunteers that we had at the beginning were mostly like younger queer kids. So they started to set the culture and set the expectations and set kind of just who was coming in. And then we gained, we have some of the old iDrum, that ethos in the space too. And because I like to do social media and engage people that way, we also developed this large online audience that doesn't even necessarily live in Atlanta or come to this space. They just know us as an online presence. And then I also, because, we're all talking about accessibility and how quickly your audience kind of gets by default narrowed down. I do think because we are so big and we're newer, that being accessible for people moving to the city from Georgia and to younger kids was just kind of an open door. And I think that's just natural as spaces, mature and grow. Yeah.
Now, this question is for all y'all, because I think, when you were speaking, Pastiche, it was interesting to hear you say, oh, we didn't really get all of that really going until right before everything was done. So this is an open question. I thought it was particularly interesting seeing it from different spaces.
Oh, I'll go.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's really important to note, Brandon, particularly because I think there's an aha moment that happens. And the aha moment that happens is when you realize that your idea is bigger than you, right? And it's like, wait, I'm holding space for more than just myself. So when the problem that I was trying to solve expanded beyond me and I started impacting more women, and then I was actually funded for, I got my first paid check. You're like, okay, I can really grow this thing. And I think people really see why I think we were able to do, all of us were able to do the work that we do, is because we had a bigger vision in mind and it extended beyond us. And so I think when you hit that stride, that's your golden stride. So as long as you are operating in that level of excellence and that vision, then the audience starts to click in because everyone is in sync. And I think that is the magic of, what Willow's done at the bakery. I've never seen anything like that before. And to me, it was such a magical place to go to see where people can experiment and play. When have you ever had a space where you can just play and be yourself with paint and installations? That is a big vision that really heralded a really great, incredible group of people. So I think that would be the aha moment for me, that really just took it to the next.
Mm-hmm. That first check changes everything.
Gotta give.
I would say there was another different type of aha moment where I guess from the beginning it was oh, we're gonna be a gallery, this is gonna be fun.
Mm-hmm.
And sales were some kind of ethereal thought in between that, and we quickly realized that was just not gonna happen. We sold one thing in 3 years.
What was the thing? What was the
aha moment was that.
What was the thing?
Yeah. Say that again, Jordan.
What was the thing?
It was a pillow in the sex show.
Incredible.
Yeah, we sold it to Corey Davis.
We did make money though, which was an aha moment. When Georgia State clubs started to approach us to have their student club shows, that was one of the ways that was the only way that we would make any money at the space. And the trick there was that we lived there, we sacrificed our living room to be a gallery. And so we were already paying rent to be in the space. And so there was no necessarily overhead. The real wild part is that our landlords seem to just either not understand or not care at all. They re-signed the lease with us twice in the middle of the gallery with blinders on, just didn't really care to know, right? Which is really, probably the most ask for forgiveness, not permission I've ever been about something, and just gung ho. as far as other aha moments, there just became a point where like every show had a lot of people there, or the supplemental programming, people kept hitting us up to be part of our drunk critiques, or we would have a screening and have all of our chairs in every sitting spot filled up, or when we have discussions about racism or sexuality or anything, there was always just a bunch of people there, a bunch of mostly young, but not necessarily young people. And we had a really good connection to Georgia State, since Theo and I were still going there when we founded the Low, and then we were alum or had walked the halls and had that relationship with the clubs and students and stuff too.
I think for that aha moment, it's sort of audience based for me. And I think when you make something, you sort of put it out into the world and say, okay, I don't know who's going to support me in this, but I know my friends will come, or the people that are in my life and who love me and are in my circle. So, you know, for a while, those are the people who show up, and it's really nice to have, you know, support from your fellow artists and your peers. But then I think when I started to look around and like didn't recognize anybody in the audience, or like who were coming to our events, that was a really big moment, because yeah, you just feel like, I don't know how these people are hearing about this, or where they're coming from. I've never seen any of these people, but obviously, you know, and that's something too, where I'm not seeing these people at other art events. So there's something that's pulling them in, and how can I then pull them in deeper into other events, you know, to go to the Low Museum or Bakery or a Tila event, you know, and how do we like sort of shape that audience then? But that was a real aha moment when, you know, you start to recognize that you don't recognize anyone.
Wow. All right. I mean, wow.
And I'd like to piggyback off of what Elizabeth just said, because that was in the good positive aha moment, there was a moment, or multiple moments, where one of the slides that Sarah was showing was Lila Khoury's show. That was one of the people who we didn't know from anywhere. She contacted us and was like, hey, can we have a show? Can I have my thesis show with y'all? And it was like multiple moments, her, Kara Mayuski, you know, like multiple people who hit us up because they liked what we were doing. And that was an incredibly validating experience to have someone who, like, when we went to the studio, we were like, oh my God, this is great. You're like, how did you, like, you want to, you know, be involved with us? And that feeling is mutual, which is like a great feeling.
Wow. Wow. Like, so, all right. This one, answer this how you want and within the bounds that you feel comfortable. But there was reference to you know, we all run spaces or have to run things in some space. What was that, you know, what was that kind of, oh, wow, I'm losing part of the question. What was that, like, I know I'm going to be asking for forgiveness moment? Like, you know, I'll give a really quick example, like Murmur's first actual noise complaint with a show that just had no need to go on for as long as it did or anything like that. But like, we actually got our first like legit complaint. And I'm like, oh, all right, we're gonna have to explain this one.
I got you.
I knew somebody would.
I got it. So I had no money starting Tila, as we probably all didn't. I was like hustling. I was working at Octane, RIP Octane on Marietta. I was cooking biscuits from 5 to 3. I was serving y'all hot PB&Js. And then I would go over to Starbucks in Cobb and be a barista. And the time I was painting in between. And before I went to my shift the next morning, the gallery. I had convinced before the presidential election on 2016 for this building owner to take a bet on me, not this other white man production company, and said, give me the keys, I can transform it. He said, you bold. And I said, of course I am. I was like, the world is up in arms. We about to lose everything. You better bet on me, okay? Like, bet on me, sir. So he betted on me. And I threw my first fundraiser event, first art show. It was titled In Search of Our Mother's Gardens by Alice Walker. I came up with the title, Drunk on My Living Room Floor, Exhausted. And he told me to give him the keys back. He was like, give me the key back after the event because we got to talk about the contract. I never gave the key back. And then it was the next year. And he was like, so you still got the key? And so you still working in the space? Yeah, you gave it to me, right? Like, it's mine now. And he was like, okay, let's work something out. And that was a moment where I was just like, I knew I could probably go to jail, but I was like, I just needed to bet on myself in this one moment. So I never gave the key back. And that's where I tested all my ideas for the next 2 years.
Taking notes, never give the keys back.
Mine came a little, I mean, there's a bunch of ways I could answer that question, but I learned mine, I think probably with iDrum, kind of painlessly, which I was thankful for because it set me up to just be super, I mean, the risk I was taking with bakery, financially, the whole package was just same thing, just gotta go for it and not look back. But I was running some shows at iDrum and there was a noise complaint from the condos or lofts or whatever across the street. I didn't even know they were there. So there's a bunch of kids on the sidewalk, people inside between 10 and midnight, and a police officer shows up. And I had a run-in with the law when I was 16, did not like that, and have just stayed head down ever since, And so I look around and I'm like, I think I was 29, 30. And I look around, I'm like, everyone here is 16 to 21, I'm the adult. And I was like, oh, that means I have to talk to the cops. Okay. And then from that moment forward, I was like, oh, I get it. I just got, before I didn't have to be that, and now that's where I'm at in my life. And it's kind of been like that ever since. It's I'm that person, and someone has to take that responsibility, and you can't always look to your mom or the adult or whatever, because you become that person. And so, but it was a great lesson and made me be a lot more confident moving forward.
Well, okay, that's a really good segue into something else. We've gone through the aha moment. We've gone through that moment of we're going to ask forgiveness. But really quickly, want to make a note for everyone watching. If you have a question, the questions are not being handled through the chat. There's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen here, of your Zoom screen. That's where you can ask questions. And we'll open that up in about 20 or so minutes for everybody. So when we're talking about, another part of this, and we kind of grazed over at the top, is that all of you are artists. All of you are producing work. How do you juggle that first year or two between I'm running a space, I'm running a publication, and I need to make money with your practice?
You don't sleep. It's a lot of kind of finding the time, right? I mean, I don't want to obviously speak for everybody, but I think most of us have had multiple jobs at one point or another, really trying to make this work. And for me, it was always more important that even if I couldn't, you know, pay what I wanted to pay, that like, if I'm asking someone to do something, I'm able to pay them. And so you know, that leaves me always the one who is not getting paid. So yeah, I think just learning how to sort of juggle, and I also take a lot of jobs as learning opportunities. So I'm like, okay, I gotta be like working in this bar, you know, 5 nights a week till like 4 a.m. I'm gonna see what I can learn here, right? So that's either like crowd management or, you know, yeah, how to like balance or how to, you know, take care of the money at the end of the night, or just how to interact with people. I think that you're always like looking for in your sort of day-to-day job how that can sort of facilitate your practice and what you're wanting to do, right? And even now, you know, working as a freelancer, I'm sort of always on the hunt for a new job, but also still always working on this other practice of like what my overarching goal is in terms of like what I want to do in the community.
Very cool.
To go off what both Tiffany and Elizabeth were saying, you know, I'm not going to get into all of the multiple jobs that I was holding down during that time, but this may be unique in that during that time, like Jordan said, this was our living room, you know, and we were, you know, a lot of the times in between shows, it was just this big blank white space. So I had my studio that I was working at in my room. Like my room was my studio. And it was an incredible privilege actually to be able to work on my stuff in my room. One, we have drunk critiques, which means that there are going to be people around that I, at any moment, like outside of school, I can have a crit. And then also there are these big white walls that I can go and photograph my work on. And so my art practice was not detrimentally affected by running this space. What I will say is that in retrospect, after moving away from Atlanta, coming to New York and being like, I'm not administrating anything, I'm purely working in my studio, I realized a lot of my leisurely creative, like my creative hobbies fell by the wayside. Like I used to make music, I was writing poetry, we would do poetry every week at the People's Town Palace with Chris Hollis. Like I was writing all kinds of other things that like now, years later, I have to relearn how to mix music because it just didn't occur to me that while I was going really hard on my art practice and administrating for the Low, all of my other hobbies fell off. Like taking custody and care of other people's work is incredibly rewarding, but it's something that like takes so much of your time that doesn't allow for many other things.
I completely agree with Pastiche that my practice, I think, really benefited from being an admin at the Low and for just having the space in general. Both of us, I think, would take turns kind of spilling our practice from our rooms into the big open living room when there wasn't shows, and it was a big open space. I think co-founding it came at a really good time because I was in my senior year of school and I'd learned how to be in a critique environment and like the benefits of that, but I also know that there's kind of a real slump after graduating art school of artists trying to find a new community. You take the one in school so for granted, and the whole like someone's watching you and grading you to do something thing for granted as well. And so to have a seamless transition from one community to another, and for that community to really be like the Venn diagram was almost a circle of Georgia State and the Low Museum, just people who were at both. I think it kept me really engaged in a very critical moment where I could have just swayed away from it. And I also just found a passion in like the production of shows. I learned a lot about how to have a curatorial vision from Pastiche and Theo, but I came into it really realizing how much just the physical production of the show, getting the things together is fun, brings me joy. I like a gallery in between a show too, or during install especially. What actually made me leave the Low a few months before it closed, or about half a year before it closed, was that I had started working at Swan Coach House as the assistant gallery manager and was being the gallery manager of sorts at the Low. And then I got the Leap Year Fellowship through Mint. And suddenly that was a chance to have my work supported and have my own studio space. And I just had to make the tough decision that I couldn't admin at the Low anymore, because between my paying admin job and this chance to focus on my practice, I couldn't juggle all three anymore.
Kudos to all of y'all, because like I respect all of y'all's work so much.
Kudos to you.
Listen, Pastiche, I'm like such a fangirl of your work, so like to be in conversation with you is so dope. I actually don't have a practice anymore, so I will be the person that just leaned into full art admin work. I just couldn't get in the space, and so for a long time, and it took a leadership coach to tell me, Tiffany, you have time. And I think I wanted to be so many things, but I knew I needed to do one thing well, and that was to lead an organization. So I took that risk, and it wasn't until a residency during this whole quarantine thing that I just unleashed on a canvas for the first time. And it was so liberating. And I was like, dang girl, I still got the juice. And I didn't realize it, right? Because I had become and morphed into this other identity of service and servitude that I didn't realize that me as an artist, I still have a voice. So thank you for sharing your journeys and making space for that, because so many of us don't. And that is also a disservice to the world. So continue to rock out with your practices. I love watching all of you guys thrive.
Oh.
Yeah, like Tiffany, like I think similar to you, you know, I have abandoned my art practice just by default. And for me, that's okay, because it's always been this like struggle between, like, I know that making work is like really good for my mental health, but I don't think, and it's not like a negative thing, people are always like, oh no, you're an artist. It's like, I just don't think that my voice and what I want to say is in the whole world of what can be said is that important. So that's where I come to art admin and to facilitation, because I think that there are much more interesting, important things to be said. So like, it's always this kind of, and both bring me stress, you know, revealing myself to the world brings me stress. Being in the studio with myself, facing myself brings me stress. Alternatively, presenting someone else to the world, bringing them to light, that also is a different kind of stress, but I find that I'm better at the external one, or that I gravitate to it. And so, you know, during quarantine, I had I think like March, April, May of just like, that first month was just like sleeping and coming down from just like working nonstop. And then I had 2 months of like, before I had to move out of bakery, of I can do whatever I want. And I got up every day for like at least a month and a half, and I wrote, and I worked on a couple writing pieces, but it was amazing. And I actually finished them and I submitted them. And it wasn't even, you know, visual art, which I miss so much, but that takes physical space as well as mental space. And I didn't have it at the time, even though, you know, I had this giant warehouse that I had all these hopes and dreams for my own practice. Jokes. I just moved my studio boxes from one room to another. But having, like, realizing the kind of space that it takes to sit down and have a practice every day and to be with yourself was like a good reminder. But I'm just like not there in my life yet. Like, I'm like, when I'm 40, when I'm 50, I'll get that studio practice back. And hopefully, you know, I'll have to relearn some things like Pastiche said, but hopefully it will still be there. And so, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, my Zoom was trying not to let me unmute. So we covered a lot of different spaces, but one thing that is particularly interesting to me as a person that came to Atlanta and saw all of you doing your thing, because I got back to the city and I went straight to big art. I was, you know, and on doing enterprise level work. You know, when you set out when you set out to do all of this, and I know we don't have a lot of time before we open this up, when we set out to do all of this work, when you have these goals or these visions in mind, where do you feel like you made that goal happen? Did you hit a target? And because we had a lot of spaces, and everybody kind of moved on and did their own thing, right? In one way or another, or transitioning. So I like to really get a sense of like, well, did you hit some goals that you have for yourself, or did you transition into something else? Everybody first.
I will say that I approach the low like I approach most things, which is pretty open-minded and without clear goals in mind. I just believe so much in you don't know what possibility will lead you to the next and where serendipity will strike and become the pivot point or something. I think that the three of us, Theo, Pastiche, and I, certainly made a name for ourselves in town as being the proprietors of this. Like, who's this cool hot new girl in town, What is the Low Museum? And I credit my work at the Low as having given me, or been part of why I got the Leap Year Fellowship, which helped set my practice in a direction as well. I've come to learn that I've really missed the side of being attached to a space in town, floating around as like a solo artist, and especially a solo artist who has a full-time job now. Like, my practice between that and the COVID of it all has really like stuttered this year. I had a show in the Contemporary in January that I've like erased from my mind, just essentially because that was the before time, So yeah, I would say I feel like I accomplished goals I didn't know I had, and it led me meanderingly to the next point, and I'm looking for the next, organization or thing to create or attach myself to meander on some more.
I think, so when we initially set out, we had, me and Davey Miner, who was the other half of Dear Verbal. So we had these sort of goals in mind of like what we wanted to create, but it kept changing all the time. And I think for a lot of people, at times that can come off as directionless, right? Like, oh, you kind of don't have direction and you're doing this thing and then that thing. There's like that term, the jack of all trades, master of none, right? Which I think is BS. I think that you can be good at a lot of things, right? So what we sort of established, we established the narrative for ourselves that we wanted to do things that we thought were cool. And also, if somebody came to us with an idea, not push them away, but figure out how we could do that with them and for them, because we had the resources to. So I think we kind of saw ourselves as like changing with the community and what it needed, right? So if that is more opportunity for independent musicians to like put their record out without being under a studio, or if somebody had a chapbook that they wanted to release and didn't know how to get that printed, we would do that. It kind of grew into a lot of different things. And I think it's also important to talk about things, having goals and then them not being realized too, because I think that is just as much a part of this practice as all those successes. So we started to shift into a nonprofit model towards the end there, and we had all these goals. We wanted to create a grant program for musicians, because there weren't a lot of, in our research, we didn't find a lot of grants for musicians in the United States, particularly, where musicians could take that money and kind of use it how they saw fit. We were interested in creating emergency funds for artists. So we had all of these goals in mind under a nonprofit model, and then it just didn't come to fruition. Some life things happened, and we lost some of our staff members and things like that, and and that kind of never happened. And I think it's okay that it didn't. I'm sad that it didn't, but sometimes your ideas are bigger than you're able to achieve in that particular moment. That doesn't mean you fail at anything, right? It just sort of pivots you in a different direction, and then also opens that space for other people to kind of come in and do that the right way. So I think we achieved a lot of goals and then also didn't achieve some. And now, because I'm sort of the only one doing the work, that's sort of why I pivoted to Strange Shapes, which is more sort of this experiential storytelling studio. And so I'm focusing more on the things that I know that I'm good at, and without the other people who are involved. So it's, successes and failures are both good things.
That is so real, Elizabeth. And I would say, I'm kind of like the youngin in the group. I'm just, kind of getting started. And I think the issue that we haven't directly talked about, but the underlying issue is that the financial and infusions that are available to emerging and indie art organizations aren't there, right? There is no one funding our work but our own personal labor, love, resources, and volunteer help. And so to me, what success looks like, and when my vision is realized, is that when I can actually remove myself from my organization and be able to hire and have a succession, right, of leadership. Because even though Tila is a derivative of my name, it doesn't own to me. Like, I have bigger goals, I have bigger visions. And so that has been my goal and my focus of this year. When COVID hit, I was on a beach in Tanzania and I was about to give all this up. I was like, bye-bye. But I knew my work wasn't done. And then I still had a lot of things to play out. And so I had to have a conversation with my team member, and I said, hey, we either turn this into a project because we're not getting paid, or we try to make it into a business. And my strategy, since realizing that the lack of funding, that the state only allocated $2 million to fund art organizations, and those typically go to the top, like the highs, the Mochas, the Atlanta Contemporary. It ain't going to Tila, right? It's not going to me. So how am I going to generate income to support and sustain our operations? So now we secure outside clients, and I've sought venture capital and seed investment. And so we just got awarded our first seed investment from New Media Ventures, which is a California-based investment firm. So everything that we're doing for the city ain't coming from the city. And so I had to shift my mindset and be a go-getter in order to transform the community that I wanted to serve. I had to seek resources elsewhere. And that is a sacrifice that I continue to make.
All right, so that is actually where I was trying. There are a couple things that I really want to kind of dig into a little bit here, because for all of us, there was a mention of trying to transition into a nonprofit model, and not being able to quite do that. If you were, I know for most cases, everybody here has operated in the nonprofit and the for-profit spaces. If you were to start something now, which direction would you take? Which tack would you approach? Because to Tiffany's point, the way that civic funding works or nonprofit funding works is cumbersome. But there's also a lot of, you get to go to people and ask them to cut the tax benefit, to get the tax benefit out of it. So I like to get some sense of how, in terms of modeling, would you go about, from your experience with what you founded to if you started something new.
I'll go on that. I have sort of had a real big shift away from like wanting to be a nonprofit or thinking that that's a model that's sustainable. I just don't think that it is here. And also there's no reason why we shouldn't be making money, as a lot of other sectors are, right? There's a lot of entertainment companies and people who do arts and things like that that make a living wage, and aren't beholden to these sort of cumbersome rules of working within a nonprofit. And there's also, the pot is sort of too small for everybody that needs money as a nonprofit in the city already. So I think finding a way, it's really hard to sustain off ticket sales. We know that. There's obviously overhead costs and things like that, which, sort of moving from space to space, that sort of helps, it helps to diminish that. But, finding a way that is more sustainable and away from that nonprofit model, I think is important. I don't have the answers for what that looks like yet, but, sort of the way that I'm working now is client-based, right? So I have a service, and, it's more like an LLC model. I have a service that you can hire me for, whether that's right now working on a virtual festival, sort of like compiling what the narrative is for that, what the physical space looks like, well, physical now, digital space. But so I have like my set of skills and then selling that to a client, and figuring out how to monetize that in a new way. And then I can hire other artists to sort of come on and work as contractors underneath that. So that's sort of like the model that I've been working on right now. But I'm sure there are a lot of other ways that, that can work. But yeah, I've moved very far away from the nonprofit just because I've seen it not work time and time again, specifically in this community.
Hey, I wanted to say, first of all, Tiffany, the other half of growing up in Atlanta, I also grew up in Tanzania, which is funny that you were there. But in terms of like moving forward with thinking about like what models, yeah, I agree with Elizabeth. Like that was one of the thoughts before getting into the residency and moving up to New York. I was like, all right, we can like try and do this nonprofit thing. And aside from the fact that even setting that up and then trying to maintain not income, but like funding structure is incredibly difficult from all of the people that I've known that have done it. Looking at Murmur with, like it requires a team and all of this writing constantly and like doing all of these things that is like not really something that I wanted to do. And then on top of that, just, like where I'm at now, which is I have like one curatorial idea that I'm planning on doing, but like other than that, I'm like, no, I'm not trying to do that. I have a gallerist who like, she does her job well enough, like not well enough, she does her job great as a person who is a completely separate job of selling art and like instilling the confidence in collectors and doing all this kind of stuff. And that's like a whole nother job that, like Tiffany was saying, like I can do that job, but I'd rather not. Like I'd rather focus on what I'm doing by myself, and then she can do what she does better than I can. And so we come together and like do that. That's kind of where I'm at right now. In terms of art, my model is just selling art. Even though I know that a lot of my art, and I've had this conversation with other artists, mentors that I look up to, or it's like, your art isn't gonna be this like, collector-based kind of thing. It's like a museum quality. So that's like a whole, not museum quality, but like archive type shit, where like it's a whole nother set of parameters and things to like think about when like creating the art and like how to distribute and sell it and like who to sell it to. But yeah, for me, like gallery model makes more sense if as an individual artist. As an administrator, it doesn't make sense to think about prospectively, but what we had at the Low Museum for me is ideal, where we already have the overhead, and as an administrator, I am just extending my resources to the artists who need them, which, you know, again, is not something that most people can do. I certainly can't do right now where I'm at in Brooklyn.
All right, anybody else want to throw in a quick word?
I want to say something about this, because I think we all get in the art space, and I think arts is typically treated as charity, and it's actually a very impactful industry with like $2.2 billion that is circulated through our impact. Like, without culture and art, we wouldn't be lively and engaging human beings. So there's an economic value to our work, and that we have to produce. It's an urgency that we are constantly producing. And if you see right now, the jobs that are happening are in the arts. The Netflix new covers are artists. So thinking about that lens, and I think it was through my training at the Center for Civic Innovation, I knew that with my artistic background that I wasn't going to be able to communicate my impact of my work in a way that was compelling to funders or investors, right? So when we're thinking about models, I never wanted to be a nonprofit. I didn't want my decisions to be delayed by the board. I didn't want people to not tell me that I didn't know how to serve my community when I know my community the best. And I wanted that autonomy to pivot whenever I wanted to, in order to be a constant person of change, right? Because you have to be always pivoting. And I think when grant funding is limited on scope, right? You have to prove that you did these many programs. You have to prove that you did this. But what if you're trying it for the first time? I ain't got nothing to prove, right? So being able to be a for-profit helped me accelerate my growth. And we did it where we knew we wanted our community. So we have a 3-tier business model. It's community-based, and it's completely free now and open. So we can just serve artists through our free studio at the Goat Farm. Then we have our agency model. Our agency model is that where we run an agency and we work with clients in these 3 different categories: commission and curatorial, brands and workshops. And then we also have community engagement or public art. And we take a percentage for it to cover our overhead expenses for administrative costs, because we're project managers. And then we have our fellowship, which is our kind of global campaign to increase representation. And that's where we get funded by corporate sponsors and brands. And so when you have that type of financial breakdown, we were able to decide how we wanted to grow and scale our operational costs and not have to lean on this grant type of funding, and therefore really understand how we can serve in the best way possible. So I have no intention of starting a nonprofit. I don't want to be a nonprofit. I'm never going to be a nonprofit. And that's just where I'm going to leave it right there.
Well, you know, it's you know, I'm with you all on that, and I think one of the things that a number of people in this ecosystem in the past and especially in the past decade, have learned is that there's a difference, and the difference is kind of night and day between getting nonprofit support, especially if we're speaking on a local level, and even on a state level, getting that kind of money. And I think it's really interesting, Pastiche, that you mentioned Murmur, because that's a conversation, you know, that was a hard conversation to have a few years ago. And now on the other side of it, there's just there's a realization, oh, you have to let that part go. Because to everybody's point, like, this is a business. We live in a creative ecosystem. And we've got there's a lot of work that's being done that goes unseen and unrecognized in the ways that are commonly understood as recognition. So with that said, we're going to jump into Q&A. There are a few good questions. Lined up. Emma, let Meredith kind of take that away.
Sure, yeah. Thank you all so much for everything that you've been talking about. And because of that, we have some really good questions for you. And I'm gonna kind of combine a few of them because a lot of people are asking about sustainability, right, in this arts ecosystem. And, you know, with the shuttering of many spaces, which has been, you know, talked about a little bit, you know, now we're in this pandemic and state of revolution. And, you know, some of the questions are about how to create longevity and sustainability. You know, in coming from Chicago, you know, there are a lot of spaces and a lot of the average lifespan is like 3 years, right? So it's like, okay to like have things pop up and then end and fill a need and then kind of go away. And so a few people are just asking about, you know, your thoughts on creating that sustainability. And Tiffany, you've talked about like your business model and things like that. And the nonprofit conversation kind of got us there. But I guess I'd just like to open it up to y'all about that issue of sustainability, longevity, like what your thoughts are on longevity, you know, in terms of the artists that you're serving, but also the greater audience of Atlanta. Yeah, and I think I'll just start it there.
I'm interested to, well, I'll just say what I'm saying. Sustainability, like multiple people in here have said already, I think, especially when we talk about even organizing on a revolutionary level, we're organizing for politics, it requires there being a leadership structure that is mentor-like and mutable, so that if one person leaves, dies, gets sick, or whatever, that the thing can still move. With us, you know, I think it's different for arts organizations because, you know, arts is this kind of like, tends to be a little bit more individualistic, and we were running something out of our living room. So that's not something that I think is always a goal. And for me personally, one of the goals in terms of longevity is just the record. I think this symposium has done a lot, or is doing a lot for that, so that people can know, oh, this thing existed. You know, like I was learning through meeting people that, you know, how the contemporary got started. You know, I think we need to know those stories. And for me, one thing that has been important is just something as simple as maintaining our website. Like the Low Museum's website has been around longer than the Low Museum at this point, that I pay for it every year. And I think it's important that that somebody says, oh, what was this thing? And they can Google it and the thing is still there. Even if we don't have, you know, shows and me, Theo, and Jordan are doing all of our own things, it's important that people see what existed and how it existed.
Can I direct the question to Willow? Because I think it's so interesting. To me, it shocked me when the bakery had to close. I don't know where the current transition is now, but I was surprised that there wasn't a real estate developer that was investing in you. You see the beacon pop up, you see all these things pop up, but the bakery is essential. So sorry, Willow, to put you on the spot, but you've been quiet, girl, so I had to call you out. I just wanted to know what sustainability looks like for you.
And so yeah, I mean, everything that y'all said, you know, like Tiffany, like you're exploring new models, which is where I really think we have to go. Yet I'm here with iDrum, a nonprofit, again, trying that route that, you know, like Elizabeth said, like I think a lot of us don't have any faith in. But I'll just step back a minute. In Boston, I worked at the Museum of Fine Arts, so like a giant institution, 1,000 people, staff, 1,000 volunteers. I was in the education department, so like working for a really big nonprofit, got that kind of experience. And then in New York, I was working with Arts in Bushwick, and we were doing, it was a nonprofit, but like so many community groups, it had lost its nonprofit standing. We were working out of living rooms, producing Bushwick Open Studios, like a huge open studio festival, as well as programs year round. And we were just I mean, that was like brutal and very, very, very DIY, just pulling it off. But you see for 10 years what this like thing that feels like it's about to fall apart at any second keeps going. And iDrum has that same like legacy, you know, 20 years plus of like being on the inside of it and watching it happen, but also knowing the structure. And you're just like, how does this thing that's this like glued together and falling apart keep producing things like this? And so, you know, coming from these different experiences, I started the bakery as an LLC, just me, decision-making power, but a lot of with a nonprofit infrastructure with the same kind of revenue splits with bands that iDrum did. So just pulling all of these experiences together to try to make something that would be sustainable, where I could pay people, where eventually I could get paid, where there would be a plan to move forward. And you know, I mean, there's so many, I mean, I work with I have a commercial real estate person. I have, you know, someone who emails me a lot saying, hey, do you want to look at spaces? I looked at spaces. I talked to, I'm blanking on his name, the developer behind the Beacon, you know, in terms of advice, partnerships. I looked at, you know, real estate for 2 years. You know, tried to talk to everyone I could who had administrated spaces and ran numbers and, you know, watched Mammal's process of trying to grow into the Met and, you know, looked at venue models. You know, coming from a restaurant background, you know how bars and restaurants and venues, you know, only make money off of their alcohol and are so close to shutting down at any moment. So, you know, really looking at, you know, for me, there are so many tiers of what the bakery was. And one of the big ones, like for my success, was running a business and not failing at that. So every month that we paid rent and hit our operating budget, like I was like, oh, that's a success. And why and how, I don't know. I mean, just straight up, the numbers never added up. Like I knew that I couldn't get who I am, I couldn't get the private funding. At this point in my life, I knew that the public funding wasn't available. And yeah, it's not dead in the water in terms of getting another space, but no one came to like George R. R. Martin Meow Wolf like into success, which just speaks to Atlanta. And I think we've all had that experience. And I don't know the answer yet, but where I'm at because of like Pastiche is saying, you know, keeping these institutional memories and these websites alive. You know, I'm going back to iDrum. I want to focus more on some archival stuff, focus more on learning the city, the ecosystem, and see if we can do, you know, we can do the traditional nonprofit model and make it work. I don't know. I don't know.
Go Elizabeth. Go.
I was just going to say, I think an important part, like that sort of sums this up, is ownership, right? So thinking about ownership specifically in space, because space is really important for a lot of our practices and to, you know, not only work out of, but also present out of. So, you know, unfortunately, oftentimes we are sort of presented with these spaces that have a lot of issues that are not necessarily sometimes up to code, or if they are, they don't have, you know, they have one bathroom, or they don't have, you know, HVAC, or if we are, you know, there's always like an impermanence to it, right? Even if we are in some beautiful, amazing space. So I think ownership is something that is really important. And it's really interesting watching sort of how people are finding ways to do that now. Like I'm really excited about Southern Fried Queer Pride and how they have sort of crowdfunded their space, which is an amazing thing, right? Because the community wants this to happen. And so instead of relying on a developer to then come in and support you in that action, you are asking your community, if you want this, let's create this together. And then, you know, sort of everybody has stake in it. And I think that's a really interesting model. And, you know, Dad's Garage did something similarly where they sort of fundraised, and they're, you know, they had partnerships and stuff, but they also crowdsourced for to purchase their building, and now they're able to use that space in a myriad of different ways, not only as for, you know, improv performances, but also to help the community. I think it's a voting precinct this year, which is awesome. So yeah, so ownership of of spaces, I think, will, you know, sort of create a more like level playing field and a more sustainable model, right? Because if you have ownership of something, then you're not having to worry about, you know, over the course of 20 years having to move so many times, because that throws a wrench in everything, and then you sort of essentially have to start from square one again.
And I just wanted to quickly say too that we need more like Jessica Hollins in our community that are fighting for policy change. I eventually want to get into policy and politics, because I think that is the crux of our work, because we don't even, with all the real estate and development that's going on in the city, we should have a 1% of all of those budgets be devoted to the arts. None of that is implemented. None of that is devoted to the arts. Our budget should be so much more larger than us being at the bottom of the totem pole in the nation. So if we don't change that, while all of these commercial buildings are going up, the sound table is going, all these places are going, we're losing our legacy. And it's frustrating as hell to me. And the fact that we just need to rally around and support what Jessica Holland is doing at C4, and how can we also be in the know about policy, and knowing that without, in order to do our work, it requires a shift in policy and mindset thinking.
A few other questions came in that kind of follows up from what Elizabeth was just talking about too, right? And you know, this sort of maybe over-reliance on developers in the city, and like what that, you know, just the building of development and overdevelopment and all those things, all those questions, right, that have been, you know, permeating our city for a while, and the role that arts play in that, and this idea of having to rely on developers to give us money to do things, and then that generates equity for them. And so what's the equity for the arts? What's the equity for us? And I also have been excited about Southern Fried Queer Pride's efforts to, you know, raise money for a space. And I guess I'm just wondering about the possibilities that open up when the organizations and the artists themselves actually have a stake in that, and like what Elizabeth was talking about, and how it actually maybe provides opportunities to fail, right? And like take risks. And like if there's this idea of like a semi-permanence, right? Of like having this space kind of no matter what, like what that opens up for people to do. You know, because, yeah.
Well, you know, I don't come necessarily from a visual art background. My background is in theater and literature, but I dropped out of school and went to ad school instead, because the question that kept coming up for me was, what of this are we owning? And what of this are we pushing? Of this are we pushing forward in a way that we can look back and say that, oh, there's a degree of permanence to spaces. So, you know, when I came into Murmur and at the end of 17, I told everyone involved, you know, Murmur is an idea that could live anywhere, but please understand that the next 3 years are going to suck. Because those 3 years are going to be doing nothing but looking around at everybody else and doing our thing and taking ownership and finding not only, you know, artwork and space to take ownership of, but also audience. The thing that everybody wants to say sometimes is like, oh, we reach out to everybody. And there are way too many people in the world. And Atlanta, even though it's big, is extremely small. And too many people give away game all the time. So that the work isn't viewed, like the value of the work is diminished. There's a certain degree of like we have to create, ownership. We have to have such a degree of ownership over our work and our spaces, not only physical but also mental, and create those kind of boundaries where we're constantly presenting a kind of magic that we say that we can then turn around and, to Tiffany's point, go like, no, this not only has like an emotional, mental, and spiritual value, this also has an economic value. We want some of that $2 to $30 billion of creative output that Atlanta influences, and maintaining a degree of ownership and kind of setting those boundaries with our audiences, and knowing what lane and owning that lane that we want to take is, to me, absolutely critical. I mean, I'm going to wrap up real quick, but like, I'm on this ridiculous new app called Clubhouse. And I'm just sitting around and listening to people just giving away content, just giving. And they're just like, oh, we want more clout. And clout never paid a bill. Not, in a meaningful way, I don't think, but that's a whole other conversation.
Pay you an exposure.
Right. And I think that's kind of been the ethos of Atlanta for far too long. Is, Atlanta's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and more people are going to see you. And it's like, well, we're kind of big now. There is some way to culturally tie a number of things that are happening globally back to this city. And I'm like ecstatic to see that people like Tiffany are going out and getting venture money, as opposed to going to the city or the state or to private funder or to foundations and saying, we do all of this and we need to track all of this data. And it's like, no. The core data that you need to track is how many people are attending, watching, or buying tickets to something, and how far does that reach? And foundations want like every single line item. And it's not sustainable. We spend more time doing that work for way less money than actually going out and doing the work.
Meredith, if we are still on this question, will you ask it again?
I don't know where the question went. Yeah. I mean, I think just like, I'm really interested in like, what all of y'all have been saying about this, like structures and like playing with models and things, and what Brandon's talking about, the cultural value, and not only cultural, but economic value of what y'all do, right? And the thing that I'm always really curious about too is like, where is room for risk taking and failing at things when so much of what the goal is financial, and like getting either money from investors, right? Like, what are the numbers they want to see? What are the things they want to see? And then, with nonprofit, it's like you have to do a certain goal and do the values and evaluations and all the things, right? And so like, where is the space for experimentation?
There's only one person that facilitates that, and that's MailChimp, really, that gives you an unrestricted financial infusion to test your ideas, right? But it's only one entity in the whole entire city. So how do we get more organizations, the NCRs, we know y'all got money, the Cokes of the world, we know you got money too. how do you give us unrestricted capital to test? The biggest thing when I was starting the Garden Fellowship, when I pitched and I finally got my MailChimp funding, he said, we don't even care if this program succeeds. We're just happy that you're doing it. I said, okay, but I know I'm gonna be successful, right? So I was like, that was just a vote of approval for me to get going. And how can we do that? And where does that shift to? And I know we're out of time, but Willow, go ahead, girl.
I was going to say, I think this idea of risk taking can also be sort of recontextualized as innovation, right? And when we're like going to get funding, you kind of have to how to talk about an idea that somebody literally can't wrap their head around, right? You know, and creative people are innovators. So I think we'll always sort of find a way. But to Tiffany's point, there are a lot of big corporations, specifically in Atlanta, that are not supporting the community in ways that they could be doing a lot more. You know, MailChimp only has so many funds, but you know, kind of creating all of these things that are risky or innovative. That's what has kept Atlanta sort of as a standout, right? And we'll continue to do that. So I think it's important, you know, if you look at all of these other cities, New York and LA and Chicago, those things are happening, right? People are taking risks and doing new things. So I think it's important to sort of facilitate that here as well.
I think as well with that, to piggyback off of what Elizabeth and Tiffany were saying, one, we also have to remember where we are physically, like where Atlanta is, and the kind of business that we get here. And that makes the pitch really different. Like we have a lot of fintech here. We have a lot of financial technology here. We have a lot of entertainment, but a lot of that entertainment business, you know, those corporate HQs are leaving. And they're pulling people out. And I think when it comes to risk, you know, it's really impressive that we have enough people that started and ended institutions in the city and spaces that we're able to fill a weekend of panelists. And panelists are also going, and like there are other people that are like, oh, I have so much to talk about. Like, can I be in on it? And they're still here, and like they pivoted into institutions like the Contemporary, and you know, and I think if you know, Jordan said something really earlier that I wanted to ask a question about. You know, when you realize that you're kind of floating in that space of I'm doing this, and we'll see what happens, but we're going to go in a direction. That gives you a lot of space to take small experiments and go, I'm going to do this small program. And if it works, we'll expand it. If it doesn't, that goes away. And I think now is a better time than any to start doing those experiments and, you know, find something low cost, low volume, that's COVID safe.
Well, so on that note, I think I'm going to have to jump in and close out the proceedings. But what a wonderful start to this weekend. Thank you so much to all of the panelists, to moderator Brandon Sheats. Thank you, Meredith, for navigating and synthesizing all of these great questions. Yeah, thank you guys all for kicking this off with so much insight and openness. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for your questions. And the next talk in the series will begin at 1 o'clock. You do need to register for it if you haven't already, and if you want to join us. I think you guys made some great points about the benefit of tuning in for, you know, more than one of these, because this is a long conversation that's been happening over decades that has been cyclical in Atlanta. And so I hope folks watching now will join us. And that will be focused on the 2000s, the OOs, and it will be moderated by Felicia Feaster. And it will feature folks from, it'll feature Karen Fain from Apache Cafe, and it will also have Brian Holcomb from Saltworks and Marie Manker from Art Spot, or representing Art Spot. It'll have James McConnell from Beep Beep and Joey Orr from Shed Space. It's a packed house in the next panel. And so, yeah, don't forget to register for that on our on artpapers.org in the events area.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah.
Can we do thank yous? I wanted to shout out some
Yeah,
people.
shout out.
From the beginning, people who have helped, you know, like Christopher Hollis and Patty helped us paint the space. Kip Nussbaum made food for our first opening. Josephine Figueroa, and Terry Kearns. Terry Kearns covered our first show on his blog, and that was we didn't know him from anywhere. It was just a huge help.
Y'all, anyone else want to do some shout outs?
Hi, Mom.
All right. So documentation of this panel and all of the rest in the series, including transcripts, more images, we have way more images than we could really share, and expanded bios from everyone involved will be coming to artpapers.org in coming weeks. We're not going to put an exact date on that. It's going to take us a second to get it all compiled, but we'll rush it to you. So if you have friends that missed this talk and you realize how much they needed to see it, let them know that it's all going to be on artpapers.org in the future. And I hope to see you guys all back on the flip side for the next panel. Bye.